Hello, welcome back. Hope you're all doing well. If you are new, welcome to my true crime channel where we discuss wrong-uns of all kinds from all over the world. And today we have the ultimate wrong-un, let me tell you. In 2011, a person is sent to prison for what would turn out to be such a shocking string of lies, fraud, murder and deceit that it would make headlines across the UK and would even be made into a TV drama. So let's get into it, shall we? Today's case starts with a woman named Claire Morris. Claire was born on the 26th of December 1961 and was almost immediately adopted by a couple from Kent named Charles and Betty Morris. This was the perfect home for any adopted child, both loving and financially comfortable, and with a baby brother for Claire also being adopted, they became a very happy family. Claire attends a private school where she's very popular. She's a happy girl who is especially close to her mother Betty. Then, as she gets older, Claire becomes a nurse specialising in eye care. It gets to 1991 and Claire is 29 years old by now and she meets a man at a party. He's good looking and charming and she falls for him immediately. This man's name is Malcolm Webster. The pair quickly become an item and Malcolm is invited to the family home. But on meeting Malcolm, Betty isn't too sure about him. He manages to immediately offend her when he calls her stupid and he's just a bit odd all round really. But Betty is just glad Claire's happy, so if Malcolm's the man for her, then fine. Now, Malcolm, like Claire, is also a trained nurse and he finds a job in Aberdeen in Scotland. It's a fair distance from where they are in London, but Claire and Malcolm are up for the change, so off they go to Aberdeen and they set up home there. Shortly after this, they get married at King's College Chapel in Aberdeen on the 3rd of September 1993. Claire is so happy and you can see that in their wedding photos. They've got their whole lives ahead of them, living in a lovely cottage in Aberdeen. But after a while, Claire starts to feel unwell. She's run down and exhausted. Physically, she looks drained. She also sleeps for days on end sometimes. And when her friends call, Malcolm tells them she's asleep, so can't come to the phone. Claire so far has put it down to the house move and the job move and all of these changes, but after a while she knows something's wrong, so she promises a friend that she'll book a doctor's appointment soon. Not long later, on the 27th of May 1994, Malcolm needs to drop a report off at work. It's midnight, but he's got a deadline. It has to be in for the next morning, so he sets off for work and Claire comes along to keep him company. Malcolm makes sure that Claire, who's still not well, drinks lots of water in the car and has a blanket. During the journey though, Malcolm realises he's forgotten something, so he turns the car around to head home. But he doesn't take his usual route. He takes a more country route where the roads are narrow and winding. It's at this point that he spots an oncoming motorbike and it's coming right for them, so he swerves and as a result he comes off the road. The car goes down an embankment and then hits a tree before finally coming to a stop. Malcolm, in shock, manages to get out of the car. He sees Claire is unconscious and he tries to pull her out, but he can't. So he leaves her in the car and crawls up the embankment to get help. Meanwhile, a bus driver named Kevin Shearer is passing by and he spots Malcolm's jeep down an embankment. He sees Malcolm on his hands and knees and rushes over to him. He asks what's happened and Malcolm mentions a motorcyclist and how he had to swerve. Kevin asks if anyone else is in the car, but Malcolm is completely out of it and he says no, so Kevin runs to a nearby farm to get help. Whilst Kevin's away, the car goes up in flames and another passerby, Elizabeth Smith, sees this and stops to help. She asks Malcolm if there was anyone with him in the car, but several times he says no. He's finding it difficult to focus on what anyone is saying to him. He seems concussed. Once the car has caught fire, no one can help. And unbeknownst to Kevin and Elizabeth at the time, Claire, who is still unconscious in the car, dies as a result of the fire. Her body is only able to be identified afterwards by dental records. So Malcolm is taken to hospital. His blood pressure and heart rate are taken and they come back normal. And all other tests come back clear too. But he's complaining that he's in pain, so he stays in hospital for 7 days. Malcolm has lost his wife just 8 months after their wedding, and now he must plan her funeral. When police tell Betty her daughter is dead, she is, of course, devastated. She remarks that it's strange this has happened because Claire only told her she'd had a near miss just a month before, where she and Malcolm had gone off the road. They were only saved by a bush, which stopped them experiencing a dramatic fall. And just a couple of days after this, Claire's friend and fellow nurse goes to Claire's house to get some clothes for Malcolm, who's still in hospital. But when she does, she spots 3 bottles of medication. It's epilepsy medication, which seems odd because neither Claire nor Malcolm have epilepsy. Forensics in the meantime have looked over the car and recorded that the car hitting the tree caused a fire in the engine, and this was the cause of Claire's death. It was a tragic accident. Claire's funeral then takes place and Claire's family do their best to hold Malcolm up. He still has a neck brace on from the crash and is visibly shaking and uncontrollably crying, grief-stricken at the loss of his new wife. Some time passes and in December 1994, Malcolm moves across the world to Saudi Arabia for a fresh start in an IT company selling medical software to hospitals. He makes some friends who, in May 1996, invite him to a dinner party, but they have an ulterior motive. They have a single friend named Felicity, who is an oncology nurse. Felicity is from New Zealand originally, but moved to Saudi to build up a tax-free nest egg for her future. And because she's been so focused on her career, she's not had a chance to meet anyone, and is not mad at all when this tall, handsome man turns up to the same dinner party as her. She finds Malcolm funny and witty, and she finds it hilarious how he calls his parents mummy and daddy in his British accent. Malcolm is equally as taken with Felicity and asks her out. Just 8 months later, Malcolm proposes to Felicity and she accepts. The couple then move to New Zealand and Malcolm meets Felicity's family, who think he's great, so they're over the moon too about the wedding. Malcolm and Felicity marry in St Andrew's Catholic Church in Auckland on 26th of April 1997, and then they go on honeymoon. They have a fabulous meal on the beach. But straight after, when they get back to the hotel, Felicity falls asleep and doesn't wake up for 36 hours. This shocks Felicity, who says to Malcolm, "Why did you let me sleep that long?" But he says, "You didn't. You got up for a while and then went back to sleep again. You just don't remember." Either way, it freaks her out, so she goes to the doctor hoping that she doesn't have something serious, because she also notices that everything she eats has a bitter taste. The doctor says it's likely vertebral migraine and tests come back clear for anything serious. But weeks later, a blood test shows problems with Felicity's liver. It's in a poor condition, a condition most commonly associated with people who've been subjected to date rape drugs. Now, usually Felicity would have investigated this further, of course, but she and Malcolm are moving to Aberdeen imminently, so there's a lot on her plate and she decides to get it looked at later, but she never gets round to it. Soon after, Felicity falls pregnant and she tells Malcolm, who, to her surprise, is furious. He doesn't want a child, they're too expensive, and he's not paying for one for 18 years. But eventually Felicity talks him round and in the end he says he's excited too. But Felicity is still sleeping a lot. She's having trouble with her speech and balance, and she visits the doctor again, but they put it down to stress due to moving countries and being pregnant. Then more stress is piled onto Felicity when she comes home to see their house is in flames. Malcolm is already there, thankfully, and puts it out, but she loses her handbag with all of her important documents in there, like her driver's licence. That being said, some time later, she spots her driving licence amongst Malcolm's things, but she assumes that he managed to save it from the fire and just forgot to tell her. In May 1998, Edward Webster is born, and to coincide with that, the family move back to New Zealand so Felicity can be closer to her family, which will help a lot with a newborn. And whilst in the process of moving, they place all of their belongings in a storage facility. But soon after, the storage facility goes up in flames. The fire is huge and everyone's belongings are destroyed, including Malcolm and Felicity's. Luckily they're insured and Malcolm makes a claim for £87,000, but the company dispute this and in the end he gets £68,000, which goes into their now joint bank account where all of their collective finances are now placed. So the family are now in New Zealand and have picked a beautiful but pricey house to live in. Felicity will use her plentiful savings and Malcolm will sell his house in Scotland to pay for it. So Felicity places a large deposit on the house using her money to reserve the property. But there's a problem. Malcolm says his house isn't selling, so he can't put any money forward yet. And Felicity is worried they're going to lose this house if they don't stump up the cash soon, and Malcolm isn't paying up. And then something else happens. Just before their reservation runs out on the house, it's set on fire. Someone has put paper through the letterbox and set it on fire. There's some damage, but it's minimal and is repaired. But that's not all. Soon after, Felicity is in bed in her parents' house where she, Malcolm and the baby are staying, and she's woken by a loud noise. She asks Malcolm, who's already awake, to go check it out. He refuses, saying it's probably nothing, but her instincts are telling her something's wrong, so she forces Malcolm to go check. And in an upstairs room, Malcolm finds an armchair on fire. He tells everyone to get out of the house and he and Felicity's dad put the fire out. The fire doesn't ruin the entire house, but it does enough damage for them all to have to move out for a while. And this whole experience terrifies Felicity. She could have died, especially as she's so prone to sleeping a lot because she's had issues with her health recently. So Felicity and Malcolm get in the car to go finalise the payment for their dream house. But whilst driving, Malcolm says the steering isn't working. They start to veer left and right, going faster and faster between lanes. Felicity's terrified, and then Malcolm loses total control and they end up careering into a ditch. Malcolm gets out of the car and goes to open the boot. He yells for his wife to stay in the car, but she refuses and gets out too. Even though they've just crashed, Felicity is determined to get this payment made on the house, so she starts to think of another way they can get there. But as she does, Malcolm suddenly clutches his chest and shouts that he's having a heart attack and an ambulance is called. Malcolm is apologetic. They were just about to buy their dream house and he's ruined it by having to go to hospital, especially as it turns out it was just a false alarm. He wasn't having a real heart attack. Felicity's gutted, but it is what it is, and there's still a few days left to complete on the house, so she still has hope. And just a few days later, the incredible happens. Malcolm's got the money for the house. They can finally buy it with their own money without Felicity having to borrow from her dad. And to celebrate, Malcolm says he's taking his wife and the baby for a picnic. On the way to the picnic area, Felicity drives and Malcolm in the passenger seat makes sure to keep her fully hydrated, giving her plenty of water that he encourages her to keep sipping on. And that's it. Things go dark. Felicity wakes up at 3 p.m. to the sound of her phone ringing. She's laid down in the passenger seat of the car and she doesn't know how she got there or where all the time's gone. She's sat in the car in a forest and it's nearly dark outside. She looks around and sees Malcolm walking away from the car through the trees with Edward in the pram. She answers the phone and it's her dad telling her to come home immediately, and whatever Malcolm tells her to do, she mustn't listen. She must just come home now. Felicity gets out of the car and calls to Malcolm. He turns round and looks shocked and says, "What the hell are you doing awake? I was only taking the baby for a walk. Go back to sleep." She tells him they need to go home, but he doesn't want to. But she insists, believing that something awful has happened to one of her family and her dad just doesn't want to tell her on the phone. Malcolm is visibly sweating on the journey home, and when they arrive, he says, "Your dad is going to tell you a lot of nonsense about me and your money." Then he gets out of the car and just walks away down the road. It's at this point that Felicity's dad tells her the truth. Her bank account is empty. and Malcolm has taken all of it. £200,000 is in Malcolm's bank account and there's nothing in hers. But that's the least shocking thing Felicity is about to discover. She opens Malcolm's laptop and finds emails between him and an estate agent based in the UK. These emails say that he would like to purchase a property as he intends to move there with his family. His family consisting of just him and his baby son, a family of 2. There are also plane tickets out of the country for his family, one for him and one for baby Edward. Malcolm has already set the wheels in motion for his future, one that does not feature his wife. Felicity also finds a briefcase. Inside there are 9 different insurance policies that amount to $1.9 million, all signed by her, except she never signed any of them. Malcolm has forged them all, learning her signature from her driver's licence. And then her ultimate fear is realised. She looks in the boot of the car and finds large amounts of petrol and newspapers. She finally realises that Malcolm has been trying to kill her this whole time. He never intended for her to walk out of that forest alive. And worse still, she believes that she may not be his first victim. Felicity's dad had saved her life by a matter of hours making that phone call. He'd suspected Malcolm was dodgy for a while and had been looking through his stuff and found the bank statements which showed that he'd taken all of her money. Somehow, shortly after this, Felicity manages to get Malcolm to meet with her in a car park for a chat. She tells him, "I know what you've done and I know what you were planning to do to me." And Malcolm replies, "I gave you a son and a good life. You'd have died happy." This, of course, sends chills down her spine, and immediately afterwards she goes to the police to tell her story. She tells them everything about his first wife, about the policies and her attempted murder, hoping that the police will get to him before Malcolm can escape, but he flees the country almost immediately. Felicity's is a long and complicated story which spans across multiple countries and years. There's different jurisdictions involved and a victim who's no longer alive, so can't provide evidence. So the New Zealand police really can't do an awful lot, especially as Malcolm has already fled the country. And the police in Scotland, where Claire was allegedly killed, point blank refused to reopen her case. It was an accident. Don't call again. So Malcolm Webster remains a free man for years. It won't be until 2008 when Felicity's sister just happens to tell this story to a high-ranking UK police officer during a social gathering that this case gets reopened and there's finally a glimmer of hope that Felicity could get justice. But let's stop there for a moment and take a closer look at exactly who Malcolm Webster is. Alexander, or Sandy Webster, was a police officer who met his wife Odette through work. She was also a police officer and together they lived in Surrey, although Sandy was actually Scottish by birth. The couple had their first son Ian and then shortly after had twins Caroline and Malcolm, who were born 18th of April 1959. Odette left work to look after the children whilst Alexander flew up the ranks to eventually become the Detective Chief Superintendent in charge of the fraud squad at the Metropolitan Police Service. Yes, Malcolm's dad was a very influential and high-ranking police officer. But as much as he was a successful man in his work, Sandy at home was quite odd. He was a very strict father and the authoritarian type. Discipline was paramount in every aspect of his life and so his family's lives. Both Odette and Sandy were very cold parents, but respectable as far as the neighbours were concerned. Weirdly, Sandy refused to use the bathroom whilst other people were in the house. So literally every time he went to the toilet, Odette and the 3 kids had to get their coats on and go for a walk whilst their dad used the facilities. So that's several times a day they were all thrown out of the house so he could go to the loo. Bizarre. The children were not to speak to their father unless spoken to, and even then, if he asked them a question, he wouldn't pay a lot of attention to their answer. As we know, the children called their parents mummy and daddy, and always would, even as adults. The children were all sent to a private school and so received a better education than most, but none of this helped Malcolm, who ended up leaving when he was 15 with no qualifications. And Malcolm was a strange boy seemingly from day one. He had no friends, but didn't seem to mind. He liked his own company. But whilst he didn't need friends, he did need attention because he didn't get any at home, so he looked for it elsewhere. Malcolm was prone to doing two odd things, and one of those things was fainting. If he was asked to do something in school that he didn't fancy doing, he'd faint. If he wanted some attention and sympathy from people, he'd faint and get all the attention he wanted. And when he wasn't fainting, Malcolm would tell kids that he had a brain tumour and again would get the attention he so badly craved. And then there was one other thing that he was prone to. Malcolm was obsessed with fire. He loved to set fire to things and watch things burn. So much so the local kids nicknamed him Pyro. He would steal nail varnish remover and get the kids gathered around whilst he set things on fire. Again, Malcolm got attention, but never any friends. He was known as the weird kid locally, and kids were told to stay away from him by their mothers. You would think that having a nickname like Pyro and him lighting fires a lot would have landed Malcolm with a conviction or two, but the son of the detective chief superintendent never got one. Funny that. Malcolm, after leaving school, decided to train as a nurse, and he even got a girlfriend, but he wasn't very interested in her. But he did manage to get her pregnant at the age of 15. He then forced her to get an abortion without telling her parents, and as soon as the deed was done, he dumped her, leaving her devastated. Whilst training as a nurse, Malcolm got a job in a nursing home but was quickly sacked because items started going missing and turning up in local pawn shops. Malcolm, as well as being obsessed with fire, also loved buying nice things with other people's money, and he always would. And then, after his next girlfriend unexpectedly takes her own life, he goes travelling for a good 10 years, and he visits many places, but he settles in Abu Dhabi, landing a job in a hospital, until he's forced to leave. 3 children, all under the age of 6 years old, die of heart failure on Malcolm's watch, all in the 6 months since he started. Malcolm is always the one to discover each child dead and is the one to raise the alarm. Supervisors spot this pattern but aren't able to prove that Malcolm is involved. Firstly, he works in an intensive care unit, so deaths do happen. Also, in Abu Dhabi, bodies are buried swiftly after death, so no post-mortems have taken place. There's no evidence to prove it was him, even though around the same time Malcolm was found injecting himself with insulin just to see what happened, and it's thought that he was doing the same to those children. No further investigation takes place and those deaths are recorded as natural causes. But Malcolm is told to leave the country immediately, and guess who helps him get home without this ever surfacing again? Daddy. It's at this point Malcolm comes home and meets his first wife Claire, and you know the rest, but we aren't done yet. We're now in the timeline where Malcolm has fled New Zealand and Felicity and is living in Oban in Scotland. The police are aware of his whereabouts and have been investigating him ever since Felicity's sister Jane told a detective about Malcolm. But the police can't just arrest Malcolm without good evidence. They have to watch him and build a case, and they've learnt an awful lot. Enough to believe that someone's life could be at risk, so they pay a visit to, wait for it, Malcolm's fiancée. Yes, another woman has fallen for his charms, and her name is Simone Banerjee, and she's about to get the shock of her life. Simone met Malcolm through working at a hospital. Simone had saved some money and was hoping to buy a £300,000 house, and she was looking at the advert for the house when she felt someone looking over her shoulder. It's Malcolm Webster, who tells her that house looks great. He knows about houses. He used to be an estate agent. He didn't. They hit it off and start a relationship, and Malcolm is the perfect man. He's so charming. Simone knows he's widowed, but he cries if they talk about it, so they don't often. But he does take Simone to visit Claire's grave. Malcolm tells her he has no children but would love to have one, given he missed out on it with his first wife Claire. And things are going great for the couple, but just weeks into the relationship, Malcolm is diagnosed with terminal cancer. Still living apart, Malcolm will call her in agony and she'll race straight over. Only she can make him feel better, he tells her. So she moves in and Malcolm starts his treatment, overjoyed that even though they've only been together for a few weeks, she's moved in. Their relationship has moved much quicker than it would have otherwise. Malcolm has to travel out of the area to get his chemo, and during treatment he sends Simone a selfie, and it shocks her. He looks so ill. He has no hair or eyebrows, has needle holes in his arms, and he's lost a lot of weight, and it upsets her to see him like that. In 2006, Simone changes her will to give the entirety of her estate to Malcolm should she pass away, and he does the same for her. Although she never sees the documents, but she knows he's done it because he said he has. And not long after that, Malcolm proposes to Simone and she says yes. He's everything she could want. He's so charming and thoughtful. He's a wonderful man. He's even a local hero at work after he just happens to spot a fire in a bin at the hospital and manages to put it out just in time. Malcolm was still at work during his treatment. He never took one sick day. Malcolm is quite the catch, and she can't wait to someday have what he's told her is his first child. And the couple are due to go on holiday soon. Malcolm's health has really improved lately, which means that they're able to go and they're due to leave very soon. But this whole time, the police have been watching. They've been watching as Malcolm has faked having terminal cancer. He's shaved his head and his face. He stabbed himself with needles and dieted to lose weight. They've been watching whilst he's been travelling to get chemo, which in actual fact has been him going on mini breaks to Paris and various other locations with one of his 3 other girlfriends. They've been watching whilst he's been using Felicity's money to pay for expensive suits and Simone's engagement ring, and they are convinced that if Simone takes that holiday with Malcolm, she'll never come back. The police hand Simone a letter. The letter says that they have reason to believe that her life is in danger at the hands of her fiancé, Malcolm Webster. Simone cannot believe what she's reading. The Malcolm she knows would never do this, but it's the police, so they must have proof. So Simone goes home and says to Malcolm, I think we need to talk about Felicity. The police have told me everything. Malcolm goes white, and just like when he walked away at Felicity's house, he does the same thing again. He walks right past Simone, who is terrified, packs a bag and drives away. The police, of course, keeping a watchful eye on where he goes, which is probably to a hotel. Simone is, of course, in shock and devastated, but any remaining love she had towards Malcolm stops immediately when she finds her life jacket, which she planned to use on a yacht on holiday. She realises that the cylinder on it has been punctured. The only life jacket that's damaged is hers, and there's only one person who had access to it. It's in this moment that she knows she was going to be next. Malcolm, meanwhile, knowing the police are building a case against him, tells family that he's suicidal, so his sister drives through the night to stop him taking his life, but she finds him sitting in a car park in full health. His sister Caroline, by the way, also thinks he has cancer, so is just as shocked as Simone when he tells his own twin he's perfectly fit and healthy and has been lying the whole time. It's thought that he pretended to be suicidal so that he could be sectioned under the Mental Health Act, knowing that this could mean hospital over prison if he was ever convicted. Malcolm over the years had many girlfriends, some almost immediately after Claire died, and he'd invite a lot of these girls to his yacht, which he bought using the life insurance he'd claimed just days after Claire's death. And to continue building a case, the police had to try to track down every single girlfriend he'd ever had to check that they were still alive, which thankfully they were, the ones they knew of at least. And in terms of the case they were building, the police still didn't have a lot in the way of forensics until Claire's liver was taken from the archives and tested. Apparently it's normal after post-mortems to keep tiny pieces of people's organs, and they've done this with Claire, thankfully. and this tiny piece of liver was found to have incredibly high levels of temazepam in it. Temazepam was never prescribed to Claire. It was, however, prescribed to Malcolm, who got it after complaining of back pain. This finding, coupled with intensely detailed police work, meant they finally had enough to get this man up in court. On the 1st of February 2011, Malcolm Webster finally stands trial at the High Court of Glasgow, almost 2 decades after Claire died. Simone tells her story, and so does Felicity, to a courtroom who likely had their jaws on the floor by the end of it. Malcolm throughout seems totally unfazed, almost indignant at the events that are taking place. On the stand, he very nonchalantly denies everything and sticks to his story, repeating that Claire's death was a tragic accident, and he left Felicity because she was psychologically unstable. During the trial, it comes out about all of the fires that took place, and there were at least 5. The one at their house, where Felicity's handbag was destroyed, the one at the storage facility, the one in their new home, the one at her parents' home, and the one in the hospital bin, which all make much more sense when you know Malcolm's old nickname was Pyro. Malcolm, at the time of the storage facility fire, had nipped out after having watched an episode of his favourite programme, London's Burning. So I think we know who started that major fire that took days to put out. It came out at trial that on the night of Claire's death, Malcolm told 3 people that there was no one else in the car, but he got away with it at the time by saying he was confused and concussed. It's also highly unlikely that Malcolm was pushed off the road by a motorcyclist. A reconstruction proved that it was actually driven slowly off the road because there was no skid marks. Plus, no motorcyclist was ever found at the scene and no one ever came forward. It's thought that when the bus driver Kevin ran off to the farm to get help, that's when Malcolm poured petrol on the car with Claire inside alive and set it alight. The first police officer on the scene that night thought Malcolm was dodgy. He even found a melted petrol can at the scene. He told his seniors, but he was pretty much told this was an accident, case closed. I wonder if Daddy got involved then too. It's known for a fact that he did make phone calls to his friends at the police around that time, so... And let's not forget, Malcolm's heart rate and blood pressure were perfectly stable when the ambulance arrived. Clearly, none of this was a shock or remotely distressing to him. Malcolm got £208,000 from Claire's life insurance, which he claimed just days later, and he spent all of it within 6 months. He didn't even pay off his mortgage. He squandered the lot and did the exact same thing with Felicity's money. On the 19th of May 2011, the jury go away to deliberate after the longest trial in Scottish legal history, and it takes them just 4 hours to find Malcolm guilty of several counts, but most notably the murder of Claire Morris. And he's sentenced to life with a minimum of 30 years behind bars. Malcolm shows no reaction whatsoever. So many people fell for Malcolm's charms. He was a master in what he did, and if it wasn't for the determination of Felicity and the detectives in this case, it's impossible to know how many more lives he'd have taken. It's just tragic that whilst Simone, Felicity and countless others have been saved, Claire couldn't be saved, and she lost her life at the hands of a husband she adored. Police painstakingly put together a case that spanned across the globe and across nearly 2 decades, but it was Claire's liver that put that forensic stamp that they needed on it, and I think it's very poignant that she ultimately was the one that put him where he belongs. Malcolm is definitely a terrible individual, but for me, there's no doubt that his father played a role in keeping him free to do what he did. I think he made a lot of Malcolm's terrible deeds disappear, and it was only once his father died that the police even started to look into Malcolm properly, because he didn't have Daddy acting as his safety net anymore. I think the women of the world are a lot safer with him in prison where he belongs, although Malcolm himself still says he's innocent and the victim of a terrible injustice. Malcolm has had to move prisons a few times because he's hated. The only thing worse than a child killer, which we can't prove he is a woman killer, which we can be sure he is, and his fellow inmates take every chance they get to hurt him. It's safe to say he lives in a nightmare of his own creation now. Claire's family said they were relieved to see her killer punished. They want people to know that Claire was a happy person who was full of life. Malcolm did appeal his conviction, but was quickly, thankfully, refused. Simone and Felicity are just mostly glad to be alive today, but they're also changed women as a result of their ordeals. Felicity lost all her savings after Malcolm squandered it all, and she's also raising Malcolm's child, which comes with its own challenges. Edward knows his dad is a murderer, but Felicity does her best to give him the somewhat normal childhood he deserves. I believe that there are a lot of crimes that Malcolm hasn't been punished for, those children in Abu Dhabi for one, but also many others that we'll just never know about. He is without a doubt a very dangerous man who is exactly where he belongs. And that's it. I hope you found this case interesting. If you did, please give me a like, comment and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. My social media handles are down below in the description box if you'd like to follow me over on there too. Have a great day, stay safe, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.